Welcome back to the Futurism at JHU podcast. I'm back for a part two with Bill Kirst. Again, he's a Johns Hopkins alum, change management leader, and host of the Coffee and Change podcast. We had a great conversation on campus for Alumni Weekend at Johns Hopkins, so that was super fun. And due to many technical difficulties and the like, including more while we're figuring out this virtual session, we're back for a part two for a virtual session. And so, just to like give a refresh everyone on what we talked about last time. We talked about your journey. We talked about tips for people at Hopkins to maximize their experience. We talked about the interaction between technology and people. You talked about your experiment where you didn't talk for 24 hours, and you said that was you learned a lot of things from that. And we were kind of getting into the realm of what should humans' interaction with technology be? Like, has it gone too far? Are we too kind of digitized nowadays? And how can we create a balance between, our screen time and our, real world time? So I kind of, just want to continue off of, kind of that point, and just, dive into that more of, do you think that maybe we've gone a little bit too far, like we're a little bit too much on our devices all the time? Or is there, a way to, yeah, again, just balance, the real world versus the virtual world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate it, Nicholas. Recently, I was just listening to a podcast that's hosted by Reid Hoffman, one of the co-founders of LinkedIn. The podcast is called Possible, and he had a woman named Jamie Tevan on. She is one of the chief scientists at Microsoft, and they have this exact discussion, right, around the advances in AI and the balance of human relationship. And one of the things I really liked about that recent episode was that a chief scientist at Microsoft is saying that while these advances are truly evolutionary and are probably going to revolutionize the way that we work and we use tech, it also brings home the notion that the human relationship matters more than ever because of that, right? And one of the things that we talk a lot about at Microsoft is this sense of AI and advanced technology is going to help us kind of reduce what we call the drudgery, right, of work. If you think about, we're even recording here today remotely, and at the end of this, you'll have to take source files and you'll have to go edit and you'll have to splice things, and some people might consider that a lot of busy work or drudgery work or work that is extremely manual. Well, with the advances of AI and some of the technology that we have at our disposal, you can take some of what we're doing, run it through an AI engine, and it can find and eliminate and help expedite essentially what you want to get to, which is your final product, right? Your outcome. Um, However, the piece that I find really interesting is that can only happen once the human relationship and human connection has taken place in the first place, right? So you and I are recording remotely now, but we had the opportunity to do part one together in a room, sitting kind of in each other's presence, in each other's aura, laughing, smiling, dealing with technical difficulties. Um, and and in some sense that created a bond, right? That created a foundation from which we can build. And so the thing I find pretty fascinating in these discussions right now is nothing that we're developing, none of the technology that we're using in such fast pace, in my opinion, is going to replace the human connection. There will be parts of transactions that are augmented or expedited or even extended, but I feel very strongly, and I'm glad that other people at Microsoft feel this way too, that the human relationship part will never be replaced. Um, and that allows us to then spend more time building connections, spend more time going for walks, talking to people, meeting eye to eye. So I do think it is a balance, but I also believe that we have to have a lot of critical focus and critical thinking when it comes to, using these devices and using the connection technology that we have. I recently wrote an article on LinkedIn, kind of through a LinkedIn newsletter that I started, and the newsletter series is titled "Leading Change in the Era of AI." And one of the um, articles I wrote had to do with sleepwalking through technology, and this concept that we might have talked about in part one. I can't remember. This concept that so much technology is coming at us. We're very excited to integrate it into our lives, but we have to ask ourselves, are we in fact sleepwalking through technology? Or are we taking a beat, taking a moment, taking a pause and saying, "Hang on, is how I'm using this in my life actually making my life better? Is it strengthening my connections? Is it allowing me to have more critical thinking? Is it changing my behavior for the positive? And probably most importantly to me, is it allowing me to leave the world a better place than I found it when I woke up this morning?"
I love that. I do remember us talking about this last time, especially the sleepwalking through technology. That reminded me, one of the co-founders of our podcast, John, he recommended this. I forget his name on Instagram, but I think it's like his last name's like Ulashin, I think. But essentially, what he does on Instagram is he does these little, short videos of like, take a breath break or something. So he'll like lead people through little breath breaks, or he'll talk about, you're probably doom scrolling through Instagram, and this is just your friendly reminder, just be aware, like scroll mindfully. And that's
Hmm.
kind of his catchphrase, is like scroll mindfully. And I think that gets at the notion of that we're sleepwalking through technology. I think, a big part of that is people on social media just scrolling through. I mean, I'm a huge I'm a huge culprit of this, scrolling through Instagram, even scrolling through LinkedIn, watching YouTube videos, even like TikTok. So it's like, it's just never ending, like, stream of like information and entertainment, that's so hard to get out of. It's like this rabbit hole. Once you're in it, it's so hard to get out. And so I think the notion of like scrolling mindfully, at least in a social media sense of technology, I think is super important. Um, I don't know. Is that something that you think about? I'm curious to hear, like, maybe like how much time are you spending on, social media, and like is there anything you're doing to kind of make sure you're not just, doom scrolling or scrolling mindlessly? Do you have any strategies there?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have a lot of opinions, and some of those opinions might formulate strategy. Before I jump into those, it's interesting because you reminded me of a moment that was pretty pivotal for me, sort of in my own podcast journey, and I'd love to sort of share that story briefly with you and your listeners. If you can remember back to the week in March of 2020 when like everything started shutting down, and I know you and I talked about that, right? Because that was part of your experience even at Hopkins. Interestingly enough, that week, um, I was actually in Washington D.C. with some family, and we were watching sort of things happen at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, uh, I need to get back to Seattle because if I don't get back to Seattle, I'm not going to be able to get back because flights were starting to get canceled and things of that nature. And so I remember talking to my spouse and saying, I'm going to go ahead and leave, the next day. And I remember he said, he's like, hey, if you want to stay with your parents, because they might be a little nervous because of everything that's happening, grocery stores are closing. If you need to get them stuff, I totally understand. And, and I said, I'll pre-order stuff for them, but I think it's really important that I get on a plane and come home. So imagine I'm flying home from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. Now, this is all pre-masks, right? Nobody has masks on. We don't really know what's going on. The news is coming in fast and furious. Parts of the world are starting to close down. And interestingly enough, I feel like everyone on that plane was holding their breath unknowingly. And as soon as we landed in Seattle, people were starting to cough. And I think it's because they were just so nervous and holding in, Nicholas, right? Like they were like, "Okay, I'm home, I'm landed, I can sort of I can cough now, I can sneeze, I can." And we we were told, by the pilot, that, they didn't have a gate ready for us, and so what was really interesting was we sort of landed from the south, and we were sort of pulling towards the terminal, and then all of a sudden we turn and we start going back, back towards almost to take off again. And everybody on the plane starts getting really nervous and they're like, what is happening? They're not going to let us off the plane. They're going to reroute us somewhere else. They might route us to Boeing Field, which is literally, it would be sort of an up down, flight. And the panic started to ensue, right? And everybody was just really, really worried. And I remember texting my brother saying, hey, can you look up the news? Have they shut down the airport? What also was quite alarming to me at the time was as we were landing, and I've landed in Seattle many times, but as we were landing, I looked down and I saw the freeway, right? It's called the 5, the I-5 on the West Coast, right? It goes from basically Canada all the way to Mexico. And when I looked down as we were landing, I counted the cars, on the freeway, and I only saw 2 cars on a major freeway. And that's when I knew, like, "Whoa, something is different." So we are on the plane. They won't let us go to the terminal, and we're thinking, that we're thinking there's going to be people in mop suits coming to get us, like the movies. And ultimately, what had happened was so many people had left the airport, including the gate agents, including the baggage people, because they were so worried about what was happening and things shutting down, that there was nobody to actually meet us at the gate, and there was nobody to take our luggage off the plane. We eventually get to the gate, and we exit the plane and we're at the airport, and it was like a movie scene, Nicholas. I mean, it was like stuff was just left places. There was like half-eaten meals and sodas and just on tables, but nobody was there. Like nobody was there. And it was very eerie. And I remember getting home, and the next day I had a pre-scheduled podcast interview with a woman, in Canada, and we were supposed to meet on Zoom and have the whole podcast. And what was interesting was, I go to bed that night and I'm like, wow, I don't know what it's going to be like to wake up tomorrow. I'm just glad to be home with my husband. And the next day, uh, my clients started canceling meetings, right? Because they weren't sure the status or their future. And I thought, oh wow, here we go. What's happening? We're waiting for town hall announcements, things like that. And I thought, well, I've got this podcast. Excuse me. Let me go ahead and join this podcast. And 10 minutes before the podcast started, the governor of Washington and then ultimately the president of the United States basically said, airspace is shut down. Stay at home. Everybody has a stay at home order. And I thought, well, how am I going to have this podcast? Like, what are we going to talk about? We're supposed to talk about the future of work, and it was all changing by the minute. And one of the greatest things that that podcast guest did for me in that moment, um, was to say, "Hey, in the middle of our conversation, how about we do a quick meditation? How about we do a quick grounding? Because it's evident that the world is really erratic and chaotic around us. But like we have a moment here, we're connecting and we're sharing stories and we're talking about the power of change. Can we just ground for a moment?" And what's really interesting is in that episode, I left part of that in there, right? I left part of that like meditation, let's ground, and I remember it like it was yesterday, Nicholas. And the reason I share this big long story with you and your listeners is because it takes a moment of courage from someone to say, "Hey, can we just take a minute and find our breath and find our footing and sort of feel into this body that we're in?" It's only a minute. You just do some breathing exercises, and all of a sudden you feel a little bit better. And the second part of that conversation is noticeably different with that guest because she and I took a moment to sort of collect ourselves and breathe and appreciate the opportunity to breathe. And had it not been for all of the events that had taken place up to that point, and even in her case, she lives on an island in Canada that's just over the border with the US. But because of the lockdown, she was now in the realization that she was stuck on that island and couldn't even get off the island. I think the only way that people typically get off that island is to get on a boat and come across into the US waters. Well, that was no longer an option for her. So you can imagine how small her world got really, really quickly. And even then, she took the opportunity to say, "Hey, we're okay. Let's breathe through this. Let's take a moment." So I share that from the standpoint, as you're saying, like mindful scrolling and going away from doom scrolling and thinking about all these technologies we use. I love that there's an Instagram person out there that interrupts your Reels feed and interrupts your scrolling with, "Hey, this is an intentional interruption to your doom scrolling. This is intentional and mindful scrolling and breathing." Or people will put those beautiful images or a kind of very peaceful music piece. And the reason they're doing that is because they're trying to evoke the sensations in your body to say slow down. Slow down. There's a gentleman who's been on my podcast a few times. His name is Julio Alvarez. He's got a brilliant podcast called Let's Go with Julio. And one of the things that he is teaching people is you may be high powered, you may be in an amazing job, you may have an amazing role, you may make all this money. None of that really allows you to be happy. And in order to understand the source of your happiness, you have to slow down. You have to really, really, really slow down and listen inward in order to sort of perform and move through the world in a way that makes sense outward. So that's a lot I said there. I'll take a little bit of a replenishment while you reflect and ask other questions.
Yeah, I mean that was quite an incredible story. I think a lot of people can probably relate to that in one way or another, where it's just kind of this moment of like disbelief of what's happening. Like I guess to quickly share my story is like I was in school and one of my teachers was like, just be ready. Like things might happen, the next, couple weeks. And that was like Thursday. And then the next day on Friday, they make the announcement. And I was like, wow, my teacher knew. Like he knew this was happening. He was just trying to like prepare us mentally. And I don't know if this was the case for you, but everyone thought, oh, this will just be gone in 2 weeks. It's just like a little fluke. And then 2 weeks, flew by, and we're like, oh, all right, maybe another 2 weeks. And then those 2 weeks fly by, and we're like, okay, this is going to be another few months.
Mm-hmm.
And a few months turn into a few years. And so I think one, thing that came to mind is just the uncertainty that people had, right? Of like not knowing, once they realized it wasn't just going to be this, quick, we're just going to, isolate and then it's going to go away kind of thing. People are realizing, oh man, like we need a vaccine, we need all this, things to work out. And so, yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of like how it's changed? Like, I feel like everyone has changed in one way or another during the pandemic,
Yeah.
for good or bad. I would say in a lot of ways, you were talking about, taking the time to slow down and reflect. I think the pandemic actually allowed a lot of people to do that because they had
Mm-hmm.
no choice, right? They were forced to stay at home. They were forced to slow down a little bit. It was a complete disruption of normal life. And so I think a lot of people, myself included, got to like reflect on their life and
Mm-hmm.
like think about just deeper things. And so I'm curious to hear your opinion on or your thoughts on, how has the kind of human psyche
Yeah.
changed, in the past 2 to 3 years because of this, kind of once in a lifetime event.
Yeah, I think the human psyche has been completely altered and transformed personally. A great friend of mine, who's a brilliant thought leader, his name is Paul McCarthy. He calls it the single greatest human experiment we've ever known, is essentially what he calls it. Not in the sense of like it was a lab experiment, but in the sense of we as humans could in no way have uh, manufactured this amount of change to go through to understand truly who we are, how we work, how we connect, how important it is to breathe, how important it is to be with other humans. We are social beings, and when all of those things were challenged, like you said, it was a Thursday that your professor said that. And then on a Friday, it was like, and the same thing. I flew back that Thursday night, and it was that Friday, doors shut, like states, borders closed, right? When you think about how much we learned about ourselves during this time, I do think it was a real bending, if you want to call it that, of the human psyche. And what I mean by that is we thought that we knew who we were as family members. We thought we knew who we were as significant others and as coworkers. And all of a sudden, when those sort of mechanisms and places and habits of how we show up are changed, meaning you can't go to the coffee shop anymore, you can't go to work anymore, you can't see your family for a period of time, you can't hug people. Um, when all of those things came to be reality, what you were left with was yourself. And I'm a believer that so much of our world was busied and we were running around and going at such furious speeds and doing a million different things that when we were forced to slow down, for some people, I would count myself in this group. I had been working on that slowing down for quite a while through meditation and mindfulness, and all of that came because I was, you know, battling anxiety for so many years and realized that one of the quickest ways to get out of that turmoil was to embrace things like meditation and mindfulness. But that journey for me goes back to 2015. I understand that many people had not had that practice before the pandemic hit. So all of a sudden, you're left in your own thoughts, by yourself, without connection. All of the things you rely on and look forward to that remind you who you are have come to a halt. That was a terrifying experience for many people. Some might, say it was like this true crisis for them, and it was. And this is why, just last week, the general surgeon of the United States said that mental health and loneliness and mental wellness are we're at a crisis point for this country. I would agree. And I think that the pandemic, in many ways, accelerated this sense of, hey, you have to know who you are inside. And in some cases, we're going to challenge the things that you think make you who you are. Because let's be honest, you and I know this, right? My thoughts don't define me. My fears don't define me. Even my dreams don't define me, right? And if I don't have any of those defining me, then who am I, right? Like, who am I left with? And that sort of internal glance or gaze, if you want to call it that, while we were in the silence and the disconnection, and we watched the world, we watched the earth, planet Earth, change too, right? It left us with these pronounced questions. And one of those questions that is the scariest question for someone to really sit with is, who am I? And it seems so simple, and you can answer the question, I'm Bill, I'm a fill in the blank role, I work for fill in the blank company, I'm a family member of fill in the, like those are all attributes, but that's not who you are. That's how you move through the world, that's how you show up, that's how people might know you. But when people sit with the question, "Who am I?" it can be very unsettling, and then you put it in the snow globe that was this pandemic for us, and it was a dizzying experience for many people. And that's why I think there were so many emergence of people doing mental health work and mindfulness work, and you know it did change the way that we deliver services to people. All of a sudden you could have health services and mental wellness services delivered through things like Zoom and Teams, and the sort of telehealth skyrocketed because it had to. I think that helped a lot of people. Apps like Headspace and Calm went through the roof. Companies invested in them and said, "We'll pay for it." Why? Because if you can take care of yourself mentally and spiritually, then it immediately means that you can be better physically, and ultimately everybody wins. Families, companies, friends, they all benefit from that. So I could obviously talk about this for hours because I've thought a lot about it, but I want people to know that are listening. Yeah, it was the single most transformative and challenging human experiment we've ever gone through. And just because we're not wearing masks anymore in certain places, and just because the president a couple weeks ago said we have the final conclusion of the emergency health crisis, doesn't mean that all the learning that we've done about ourselves, the question, "Who am I?" doesn't mean that's done. You get to sit with that still. You get to ask the question. You get to see the world through that lens, and then make really important decisions for you, for the ones you love, for where you invest. And again, back to what we said earlier, how you want to leave the world. Like, what's your legacy? What do you want your legacy to be? You and I have talked about that, right? We think about that because I think we carry the sense of it could all end tomorrow. So, what do you want your legacy to be?
I love that. I that really got me thinking about yeah, like the who am I question. That's something even before the pandemic that I've always thought about. Or not always, but kind of once I started getting interested in like neuroscience and the brain, which was around eighth grade. I always tell the story. I was another story time, but I think it's a fun story. I was eighth grade, sitting down doing math homework in my room, and all of a sudden my dad starts yelling at me. He's like, "Nicholas, you have to come here." And being the stubborn eighth grader I am, I ignored him, of course. And then he yells again, and then this time I'm like, "What? Like, what do you want?" And then he just says, "Come here." And I ignore him again. And then the third time he says, "Nicholas, you have to come here." I was like, okay, it's got to be something important. He wouldn't be, persisting. And so I kind of just like dragged my feet into the living room. And he was sitting on the couch in our living room, pointing at the TV. And I sat down on the couch. He pressed play. And it was this about an hour long episode called The Brain with David Eagleman.
Mm.
And David Eagleman is a neuroscientist. He has his own lab, his own companies. He also teaches at Stanford. And I sat down, and I kid you not, the whole episode just flew by.
Hmm.
Like what was an hour felt like maybe 10 seconds. I was just completely in awe. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Like the way Dr. Eagleman was explaining the brain and how it's like this bundle of, neurons and synapses, like trillions of synapses, billions of neurons, in this like chemical and electrical kind of storm. I was like, this is so sick. And like the fact that it's literally everything, it defines everything that we do and everything we are. Well, depending on there's also the spiritual factor that comes in, but in terms of like just functioning as a human being, the brain is like the motherboard or like the kind of the head of everything you do. And I was like, that's what I want to study. Like there's nothing cooler than learning about like the driver of human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so from then on, that kind of started my journey into neuroscience, and I've stuck with it for the past 7-8 years. But that kind of led to things of being super introspective and thinking about like who am I and those kinds of questions. My family moved states in right after I got interested in neuroscience, and when I got to my new school, I immediately started. I've told this story on the origin episode, but I started a club called the Future of Science, and it's kind of similar to Futurism, but
Mm-hmm.
it was more of just casual talking with people about science and tech, and then we do some like fun activities, and it was more just like fun side project, passion project, and obviously that's led to this podcast, which I feel like has been the kind of ultimate form of what I've been trying to do for so long. And I finally realized this is what it needs to be. Like it needs to be this podcast because we need to get this, amazing information out to the world. Um, but yeah, so I think just like being interested in the brain led to the thinking about the who am I question. And so even before the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic just accelerated that even more
Yeah.
because now I was like, okay, I'm kind of here with myself. Like you said, everything else was all the external stuff goes away and you're just left with you. And again, for a lot of people, that's unsettling. It was unsettling for me too, until I realized, wow, this is like a very amazing opportunity
Mm-hmm.
that you don't get a lot to just like the world is permitting you to
Yes.
sit with yourself and, reflect and introspect. And so, yeah, that was like when I started adopting things like meditation, like you said, like I
Mm-hmm.
started using the Calm app. And I'm trying to get back into that because I've been a little not using it as often as I should. I got into this, gratitude app and
Yep.
journaling and just trying to take care of myself mentally, right? I think that's something that's come about this pandemic is people are now realizing there's not just physical ailments, there's also mental ailments. Like mental health is a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that, is becoming more widely accepted and people are realizing that, self-care and meditation and gratitude, and just taking care of yourself mentally, there's this balance between the mental, physical, like you said, spiritual,
Mm-hmm.
I guess emotional, even that kind of overlaps to the mental. But yeah, I mean, for me it's been this incredible opportunity to just learn more about myself and like what my values are. And I think now that we're back in full throttle, with the official pandemic kind of being declared over and all of that, it's definitely a little bit. It feels a little bit harder to do
Yeah.
that reflection and introspection. And so I'm definitely like trying to once in a while. Obviously, right now I'm in like studying. We have like reading period, so I'm in the studying zone. Also, been getting over a little bit of a cold, which is why
Mm-hmm.
my voice is a little raspy. But yeah, it's just like hopefully maybe once finals are done, I can just like sit down again and just reflect, um, and hopefully even during reading period, maybe do a little bit of journaling or do a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of calm, just to kind of center myself because I think this goes for a lot of Hopkins students, but a lot of the time we're just go 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 go, and that can lead to a lot of stress and anxiety, and it's important to balance that out. So that was
Absolutely.
my my long story. Um, but yeah, the pandemic I think really accelerated the mental health discussion. It also really accelerated the notion of like how important family is.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that to me is one of the greatest things of this pandemic is we realized we lost so many people during this pandemic, and it just it was a very stark reminder. I lost a couple family members due to
Mm-hmm.
this pandemic too, and it was a stark reminder of like how important family is and like just being there with family, like spending that quality time. Like you said, you don't know when the next time you'll interact with them is. It could all end tomorrow. And so just like really having that gratitude and that like level of like just realizing how important your connections are, I think is one of the greatest things to come out of this pandemic. um, And then, of course, on the technology side, I think the pandemic has accelerated things like never before. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously AI, and that's kind of where I wanted to take this
Sure.
the
Yeah.
discussion, because that's
Yeah.
kind of your, um, like you said, your phrase is leading change in the era of AI,
Yeah.
and I think that the pandemic has. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, but I feel that it's really accelerated kind of the advent of AI and people's adoption of technology, especially as we've been pushed more and more online. And so, yeah, would love to open it to you and
Sure.
hear your thoughts on like how has the pandemic, changed kind of the adoption of AI and new technology.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the greatest quotes I read from Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft. This was probably just a couple months after the beginning of the pandemic. And you probably recall this, Nicholas. Many of your peers do as well, right? All of a sudden, you shift to like classes on Zoom or classes on Teams, right? And one of the quotes he had early in the stages of the pandemic was, "If you feel exhausted um, at work, there's a reason, and the reason is because we've done 2 to 3 years of digital transformation in a period of like 1 to 2 months." And hearing him say that, it kind of put into perspective the sense that what used to take, no kidding, a runway of 2 to 3 years, the amount of technology that you would have implemented, that would have changed your habits, that you would have learned new tactics and skills. In some cases, people had to learn it overnight. And I remember when I was in consulting, the implementation timelines of bringing this technology into workplaces used to be a multi-year thing. And why is that? We think about that now, or like, why would it take years to implement Microsoft Teams or help people adopt a remote workforce? Well, the reason it took years is because there wasn't this sort of external factor that caused you to have to use that. And so some people would use it a little bit and then they'd go back to their old habits. Some people would use it a little more and then they'd go back to their old habits. We know as human beings that inherently we resist change. Like, that's just a true fact. So anybody listening who feels like, "Oh, I wish I could be better at accepting change and I wish I wasn't as resistant," I want you to give yourself a break. I want you to literally give yourself a moment of grace, because it is just the human dynamic and the human condition that when change is introduced to your eyes, your ears, your body, your defense mechanisms go up. It's survivalism. That's just what it is. I mean, you know this, Nicholas, studying neuroscience. We can see it in the brain. We can see it, the parts of the brain light up that say, hang on, time out, warning, warning, right? And then what ends up happening is, depending on your system, right? Sometimes your body flushes with adrenaline or cortisol, and there's all sorts of after effects that happen there. And so knowing that and seeing people interact, those of us who are leading teams and organizations and institutions like Johns Hopkins through change, we were conscious of that. We'd space it out and we'd say, okay, this is the natural, logical, timeline of introducing this much change. And then the pandemic hit, right? And so all of a sudden we have students who have to do their classroom online. Teachers and professors have to learn how to use that technology. Churches, religious institutions, I mean, you name it, everybody had to figure this out. But I think the difference that made it achievable within a day or two or a month is that everybody had to figure it out. There was no other option. So, to your point around the power of community and working together and helping each other, like, that's what made it possible, right? It was a slice in time where everyone felt the exact same thing happening to themselves. And it's almost like that difference went away, right? Because it didn't matter. This was an airborne, um, you know, thing that we were afraid of, and all of a sudden we're like, wait a minute, you mean we can't breathe? What do you mean we can't hug? What do you mean? And so when all those things that we take for granted have to be challenged, in your body, you slow down like we talked about. And so when you do slow down, all of a sudden you have the ability to say, hang on, I think I can do this if I apply the right mindset to it, right? It was a growth mindset. Everybody had a growth mindset. You had to. It's the only way you could get through this. Why? Because there's no textbook. There's no textbook that told you, hey, on Monday after everything closes down, like, here are the steps you got to take. Um, there was no rule book for this. We've never done this before. And so the answer was do the best you can. And it's amazing what happened when everybody said do the best you can and trust each other as human beings, that they're doing the best they can. We were able to do some amazing things. And that to me was what advanced technology so quickly. The other part, when you fast forward it to where we're at today with, AI and the application of AI, we realized that there were so many opportunities to accelerate and extend technology in ways that truly delighted us as humans and maybe even felt a little bit magical. And what I mean by that is when you think about some of the AI today, be it through ChatGPT, 4 or DALI 2, or even something like Copilot, which Microsoft has introduced to the world, some of what you're doing feels a little bit magical, right? You type in a prompt and you get compelling, critical, charismatic thinking in some cases given to you. The human mind can understand what's happening, but it doesn't always comprehend it because it's like, hang on a second, how did it deduce all this? How did it get all this information? And how did it do it in a way that it sounds like a human? Going back to what we said before, I don't think it'll ever replace empathy. I don't think it will replace compassion. I don't think it'll replace connection. However, it does augment those things. And what I mean by that is I have had specific cases where people have said to me, hey, um, I actually use ChatGPT to help me understand what a friend who is struggling with substance abuse might be going through. And I said, really? How did you do that? And they said, well, I asked ChatGPT to help me write a letter to a friend who was struggling with substance abuse. And then I asked ChatGPT to help me reframe it to be more compassionate and understanding and less judgmental. Now, I share that example because that was pretty eye opening to me from a friend who shared that, because the challenge this person was going through was every time they sat down to write to their friend to say, I care about you, their emotions took over, right? We talked about before, right? The emotions of fear of losing that person, the emotions that come along with the judgment of someone who is in it, it's in substance abuse, the how society judges those people, and all of those external voices come into your mind, and before you know it, your pen is writing all of these things that are opinions of other people. And is it really who you are, right? Is it really what you want to say? Now, you would think to yourself, how can technology help that human be more compassionate? Well, in that instance, technology helped that person just take a slight step out of their emotional captivity for a moment to consider rephrasing or reading how something might be rephrased so that it lands better with the recipient. Now, if you'd said that to me a year or two ago, that people would be using kind of a prompt mechanism to draft poems, to write letters to friends who are struggling with substance abuse, to research how to put together plans for rolling out technology and making it easier for people to adopt that change, I probably would have told you, like, maybe that's 10 years away, but it's not. It's here now. The question to me becomes, how are we using it to remind ourselves of our humanity? I think it's wonderful that it's used to simplify coding. I love that because it leads to innovation, it leads to advancement. I think it's wonderful that it can take away some of the drudgery of the work we do. Its summation capacity is amazing. I think it's great that you can take, a technical document and say, give it to me in a haiku, right? That's all fine. But the part that really kind of sparks my interest is when people are weaving it into their everyday existence to say, help me tap further into empathy, compassion, and being a human being. When you combine those two things, or it frees up time for you to tap into those things, that's the wonderment for me. If you and I are working on an assignment and something like ChatGPT or DALI 2 or Copilot allows you to get to the outcome faster, and then as a result, you and I can take a 2-hour walk and unpack the world and all its challenges, and we can have imagination and discourse, then I'm all for it. That to me is where this technology is truly evolutionary and in some cases revolutionary.
Yeah, I I'd never really thought about that, like the human element or like the compassion and empathy element of ChatGPT. I think I was thinking about this of like I'm assuming that OpenAI when they were creating ChatGPT were not thinking about that use case of
Mhm.
like could someone who has a friend with substance who has substance abuse, could they use ChatGPT to write a letter to them? I'm assuming that was not on their radar.
Right.
My guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they just wanted like a, it almost feels like a more advanced Google to me, in the sense that it's like synthesizing information from whatever kind of what is it called, data scraping that it
Mhm.
did, whatever data it was fed, like pre 2021,
Yep.
or pre September 2021, I think they say. Um, and so it's very interesting to me that people have kind of used the word bent. I feel like people have bended this
Mhm.
technology to the way that most suits them and their needs. And I think that's pretty incredible that this technology, which I don't think OpenAI had, really thought about all the different applications, people are finding new applications for it every day
Mhm.
and using it for, honestly, I've really mostly heard ChatGPT being used for like good things.
Mhm.
Like a lot of technologies, I know there's the whole academic integrity thing with ChatGPT of like people were writing essays, and now there's like anti ChatGPT software to combat that. But yeah. Oh, am I frozen on your end?
No, I can see it fine.
Oh, okay. Maybe it's just me. Um, but yeah, I think it's quite incredible. Um, like how many different very positive applications people have found for ChatGPT.
I think
Um,
the other thing, just
yeah.
to your point around the scraping of all of that data, right? And people have to understand this. It's pretty, like, when you say it, we say it so nonchalant, right? But people need to understand, like, the enormity of that fact, right? That OpenAI has been able to, with the computing power that they've invested in and partnered with, they've been able to scrape, literally grab hold of all of the data ever created on the internet up till September 2021. So imagine, I want people to imagine for a second. You've got a fist full of glitter, right? We all know glitter, right? Just imagine plunging your hand into a jar full of glitter, and you've got glitter in your hand, a fistful of it. And now I want you to imagine, like the song from Pink. You throw a fistful of glitter in the air, right? So throw it up in the air, right? What happens? Like, the glitter goes everywhere. Now I want you to imagine somebody comes to you and says, I want you to find this one piece with this one color in all that glitter that's now dispersed at your feet. It's humanly impossible. I mean, some people might be able to do it. If they are, they're probably an X-Men of some sort, but it's humanly impossible, as we understand our capacity, to find that one piece of glitter. But with the advancement and the application of things like AI, you were able to do that. And so when I think about the scraping of all of that data and then finding that one piece of glitter that you need for that particular purpose, that's where things like the application of OpenAI and this technology we're talking about, that's where it kind of excites me even further because I have to say to myself that the speed with which that request is done is frees me up to do so much more. And it's not so much like the completion of that task that excites me, it's the what's next. What's next with all the time I have? What's next with all the imagination? What's next with the sense of compassion that comes from beyond that transaction? And to your point, I don't think that Sam and Greg and others who are the founders of OpenAI, I don't think they necessarily thought that. But I will give credit to them because in many interviews that people can listen to, they have been very clear to say, we don't know how it's going to be used. We don't know. We'll continue to learn. And something that you and I were kind of circling around before, Nicholas, is this sense of the more I learn, the less I know. And that truth keeps me going every single day. And I think that truth keeps Greg and Sam and others in OpenAI and Satya and Microsoft and others. I think it keeps them going. That to me is part of the human condition.
I really like that. The more I learn, the less I know. I think, yeah, I really like how you put that. Like, yeah, really like yeah. I mean, I don't even want to try to explain that because I think it's perfectly said. Um, but yeah, I was curious about like how you implement, um, different AI tools,
Sure.
ChatGPT included, into your life, whether that's professional, whether that's personal. Just curious to hear, what role it plays in, your everyday life.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is important to remind people is obviously there's kind of the instances that we know about with ChatGPT, which is kind of the consumer version, right? If the OpenAI version, it's a version that you can access as an everyday consumer, and I can as well. If people know about like Bing Chat, that's the Bing Chat that comes through Microsoft. You know, it's important that people understand kind of the distinction between, hey, what you plug into just OpenAI, ChatGPT as an everyday consumer is different than what organizations and institutions and companies who have their own version of that, right? Think about it from the standpoint of like theirs is a copy of all of that data, but is placed within the security of their own data graph and cloud. Right. So I want to make that distinction for people because what's important to remember is with all this AI comes a great deal of responsibility and accountability. And so I say that from the standpoint of I don't want people, and again, this is probably more of like an advisory. I don't want people who are working at companies or institutions or whatever to just go into Chat GPT and plug stuff in that is confidential or business sensitive or any of that, right? People should refer to their AI ethics officer and legal teams within companies and institutions to do that the right way. That said, as an everyday consumer like you and I are, I think one of the ways I've used ChatGPT is to learn, right? I mean, I haven't plugged many prompts into it yet because I think I'm more in that observation stage of let me see how other people are using it. But case in point, I tested it and I said, "Hey, let's see how well it knows certain things." And I went in and told it to tell me about the podcast Coffee and Change, my podcast. Now, I've done this a few times because I said, well, let's see what it comes back with. Let's see how it gives me a synopsis. Let's see if it captures the number of episodes that are out there. And let's see if it correctly reflects the host and my vision. Well, each time, and I've done it about 3 or 4 times, it got smarter. And the first time the synopsis was great, the number of episodes was incorrect, and the host name was incorrect. I thought, well, it's interesting. It's attributing this podcast to some other person in New Jersey. Now, of course, I look up that name, right? And that person does have a podcast, but it's about financial matters, nothing to do with change. It's like, okay, so maybe it's thinking the word change is like literally coin change. And so again, it's a model, right? It's a learning model. It's a large language learning model. So I gave it a pass. And then a week later, I keyed it again, almost the same prompt. And this time, the synopsis was great. The number of episodes was correct. The location of where it's done from was correct. The host was wrong. I was like, okay. So it seems to be struggling with the name, right? It seems to be struggling with the name. The third time I did it, it got all of those things right. And this time, the synopsis to me was even better. And so I thought, wow, I really like the way that ChatGPT surmised what this podcast is about. And the fourth time I plugged it in, it went even further and it said, this is a podcast that would benefit entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, inventors, business people. And I thought, I've never thought of it from that angle. Like, I haven't thought about this platform I built as a potential curricula for entrepreneurs or inventors. And so all of a sudden I thought, wow, ChatGPT just gave me a potential new audience, right? And all I asked it to do was tell me about the podcast Coffee and Change. Okay, so that was example number one. I'm excited to keep trying different things, and in that realm of the more I learn, the less I know, and that's the approach I'm kind of taking with it. So that's ChatGPT. The second one I'll share with you is what's called DALL-E 2, right? These are the image creators. If people are familiar with the tool called Designer at Microsoft, this is where you can type in whatever you want. I want an Instagram post with two people talking in front of microphones, and I want it to be in the form or style of Monet, right? And you think like, how's that going to come? How's that going to come back? And sure enough, it does. Now, is it right every time? No. But the part I like about it is you can say regenerate or customize, or maybe a little less Monet and a little more tech, a little more digital and a little less painting. So imagine it's kind of like that fistful of glitter, right? Imagine I'm able to go down and pick up little parts of that glitter and then make a mosaic, right? I want to make this mosaic and I want it to look like this. But more importantly, I want it to evoke an emotion. So I'm now at the point where I'm flirting with the idea of, do I use these tools like Designer, these DALL-E 2 image generators to help design cover art for podcast episodes? I also use Canva. I'm a huge fan of Canva. And Canva has all sorts of AI tools built in now. They call it magic, kind of going back to what we were saying before. And so I'm flirting with that too. And as a creator, I think it is a debate ongoing, right? Which is, well, what happens if it mimics or um, sort of favors somebody's style of art or creation? And I know that's an ongoing debate. Won't solve that here, but one of the things I am conscious of is moments of inspiration oftentimes come from other creators. And if you can use those opportunities to then further extend, grow, compliment, and always give credit back to those people, I think that's a wonderful symbiosis. Case in point, I use Unsplash a lot. Every time I use Unsplash, I absolutely credit that photographer, because people will say, wow, this was a really um, kind of eye-opening or captivating LinkedIn post. The imagery you used was great. I always cite that photographer or that creator because they helped me get to a point where I was inspired to write something based on that image, and it helped someone in turn. And you pay it forward and you pay it forward and you pay it forward. So I think these discussions around these tools are fascinating. And then the last part I'll say is we use it with audio, right? I use Descript And Descript is pulling in a lot of tools to help with the simplification of generating transcripts, the simplification of doing uh, audiograms and snippets, things that, again, as we talked about before, the attention span of people is now 6 to 8 seconds. So you've got to capture their attention somehow, some way. And AI is helping us do that by focusing on, hey, this is going to be the thing that's likely most compelling in this reel, in this audiogram. And it's up to me to then say, what's the balance? I don't want to turn everything over to an AI generator because I enjoy this work too much, right? We talked about this before. Me going through and editing an episode is meditative to me. I don't want to outsource that. I like that. Now, I might outsource some of the work around, um, cleaning things up or reposting things. That's fine. But I have to remember that this human experience, this human body that I'm in, some of the things that I do bring me a sensation of delight and joy. And if AI tools can help me get closer to these moments of delight and joy, I'll continue to use them. If it goes the other way, we'll be having another discussion in probably about a couple months or a year.
I love that. I think, well, personally, since I'm not much of a technical person, and Ricardo, one of our co-founders, he's really the main tech guy,
Mm,
and so he's historically done most of the audio and video and everything. So he's kind of like the person who does that. But and I think like you said, I personally would probably prefer to outsource it, and in a
hmm
sense, I am outsourcing it to Ricardo. But I do think Ricardo really enjoys like that process too, and
Yeah.
so I think, like you said, maybe it's this experience of doing it yourself that's really rewarding. And I think I totally agree on the reposting and stuff. Like the stuff that is not really you, I guess, like providing value to
hmm
what you're putting out. Like the editing is really providing value because you're creating a better product to release to the your listeners. But I think that just reposting, I think that's something that, like you said, could maybe be better off being automated, where
hmm
something can just send out the same thing to different platforms. And I've just been kind of doing that manually, and I'm
Yeah.
sure you do that as well. But yeah, that could be something really good to automate. um, so yeah, I think I just wanted to like wrap this up with letting you give a little plug to your podcast.
Sure.
I've given some listens, and I think it's some pretty incredible stuff. I mean, like I told you, my mom is also kind of in your realm of work
hmm
with the change management and thinking about personal development and growth. And so yeah, would just love for you to tell us a little bit about what Coffee and Change is about, what inspired you, and maybe what do you see as like the future of it moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with what is the future of it moving forward. I don't know, honestly. Like this is again, it's I consider this platform and this podcast that I started almost 7 years ago. It's a companion to me, and I learn as much from it as the people that listen to the episodes learn from my guests and from me occasionally. And I like that fact. I like the fact that this thing started truly as a way to help people feel less lonely in the world. That's it, right? Like that's when I think of my mission and my vision of this podcast. It is about combating loneliness at its core. And when I think to back to moments where I was at Hopkins and even after Hopkins, right, I think there's an element of what it means to go through the experience that I went through, that you're going through, that your peers are going through, right? This academic rigor, this pressure, this achievement, this sense of critical thinking. There are bouts of loneliness in there, and I think personally, along that journey, I wished I could have had someone to say, "Hey, here's what it was like for me," or "Here's a story." or maybe even the words, "You're not alone in this." And when I think about the 122 episodes of people that have come on my show, I think whether they say it or not, whether they know it or not, I think in some ways each of them is talking to their younger self when they talk about how they're going through change and what people should do and the advice and the recommendations. I think some of them are speaking to their younger selves, and to me that's therapeutic. That's healing. And if people hear that around the world and benefit from that or feel like they can take their next step and change, then to me that's a win. And so that's what this is for me. It's not about chasing metrics. It's not about chasing listeners. It's not about getting, accolades and recognition. Those will come in their own way when you follow your passion. You don't really have to do much else. And so for me, it's kind of this living classroom, Nicholas. I consider it to be such a gift. And I have found my voice in a way. I'm a person who thought, oh, this is who I am. Again, back to our question, who am I? Right. I thought this is who I was. And then every time I meet with someone and hear their story and reflect on their story or ask a question that I didn't even know I had, I learn something about myself. And then I say, oh, who am I? I'm still answering that question. Who am I? And there's so much generosity in that and grace and just patience that comes with it. So for me, that's what coffee and change is. Recently somebody said, my spouse recommended and others said, maybe you should call it coffee change and culture because I'm starting to interview people that are artists and singers and songwriters and people that truly along their journey have helped me survive as a human. I mean, I wouldn't be here without the music, without the songwriters, without the people who inspired me to keep going. And when you get to have songwriters on, musicians, artists, heroes, even, and thank them personally for the role they played in your life, there's no better feeling. There's just not a better feeling. Like it's intoxicating in all the right ways. And so that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to keep doing. And I like that it's very solopreneur. I like that I have no boss in this. Um, it may lead to turn into a course someday. Who knows? People have said that. They're like, you realize that you listen to 50 episodes of your podcast. It's like a PhD level course on life. And I said, no, I didn't realize that, but it's great to hear that. Um, and in hearing that feedback, it's such a reminder of remember who you are and keep asking questions, keep meeting people. AI can do a lot of stuff. It probably can generate questions. ChatGPT can generate questions for me and my guests, but it can never measure and match the compassion, the empathy, and the curiosity that I as a human have. And so I will keep going. And I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing because it's helping students, it's helping entrepreneurs, it's helping thought leaders, and it's just been a real honor for our paths to connect. I look forward to having your mom on in the future for sure. And I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to share, to connect, and to echo.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Um, I really appreciate you, making the initial connect with me. Just being, truly incredible mentor and supporter of the podcast, and you know, also being just an incredible role model because you've been doing this for so long. Just seeing how you do things helps me a ton in terms of where do I see my podcast going and what are the right tools to get me where I want to take the podcast. And so, yeah, thank you for, your mentorship throughout this journey and, looking forward to more, conversations and
Yeah.
connections and listening to your podcast. And so, yeah, so all the listeners out there, go follow Bill and the Coffee and Change podcast. He's on all platforms:
Yep.
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Instagram.
Mhm.
So go check him out. Go give him some love. Um, and yeah, this has been alumni episode with Bill Kirst and the Coffee and Change
Go
podcast.
Hopkins.
Go Hopkins. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right. Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you, Bill.